Um, Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Doryun Chong. I'm a curator at the Museum of Modern Art here to be in conversation with artist Haegue Yang. So what we thought we are going to do is to talk about three solo exhibitions Haegue had this year in 2011. So she's been extraordinarily busy, and I've been also busy trying to follow those exhibitions around. But I was lucky to be able to see these three exhibitions we are going to talk about. So we thought we are going to go from exhibition to the next exhibition and describe them fairly quickly and also explain a kind of what I thought was a significant turning point in your work. Perhaps it represents a stage of evolution. And having known Haegue for several years and have worked with her multiple times, it was quite a bit of surprise for me as well. So I thought maybe we'll try to share them with you. So we start with her solo show titled Arrivals. I'm going to start by doing most of the talking just in case you're wondering why I'm talking, but she asked me to sort of describe these exhibitions to you, and then I will try to engage Haegue with some questions. So starting with the third floor of Kunsthaus Bregenz in Austria, and some of you must know this great Peter Zumthor building, a kind of bunker-like building with a beautiful glass ceiling, where she populated the space with 33 light sculptures. In other words, the sculptures that use commercially available light stands, or rather display racks or stands with light bulbs and various kinds of materials. So this included 33 sculptures again, and then we have some images of those individual sculptures. And Haegue, I thought, well, one thing that really struck me about this installation was the kind of crazy titles that you gave them. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what those titles were. I mean, there were many of them, so if you could explain whatever you can remember. I think this was
the first sculpture of the female native.
right.
And just to add up, the whole floor was titled as Warrior Believer Lover.
Warrior Believer Lover.
And I conceived whole floor consisting of 33 sculptures, which will not be necessarily shown together again.
Yeah.
So this constellation of Warrior Believer Lover, as you see here, is more or less very conceived from the beginning temporarily.
Yeah. And then this is still part of the female natives group. There were 6 sculptures in this group.
And female natives, as you see, is employing mostly artificial plants made out of plastics. So it gives a kind of idea of organic nature.
Right.
But at the same time, it's very synthetic and artificial, just appearance of nature.
Are we still with the female natives group? I can't remember. What's the title of these sculptures?
I don't remember.
Okay, so I'm going to run the slides, but what was, again, very striking was that the titles were things like, I think we're going into the second grouping, which you titled Medicine Men, right? So
He knows better.
Well, female natives, medicine men. There were something called totemic robots.
Voila.
And then there's circle dances and kimono temples. So these were sort of very evocative titles in terms of sort of evoking exotic cultures, if you will. So there was something rather exoticist and sort of primitivist about it. I mean, if you say female natives, the first thing that I thought of was Gauguin, for instance. But just to complicate this whole story, if you recall that installation in that whole floor, periodically the music will come on and that the lighting will change and sort of activating the space all these sculptures were sort of self-illuminated by the light bulbs that are contained within them rather than by lighting from the ceiling, and the music was Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. So when you realize that, then when you understand that that's the music, then you begin to see these sculptures in a more anthropomorphic terms, and if you know what the Rite of Spring is about, then it involves a kind of a shamanic ritual, right, in Central Asia.
Native Indians.
Of Native Indians, right. So Stravinsky was partly inspired by Native Indian as well. So, I mean, this was the first time that they used this musical or sonic element in your work and turned the whole thing into a kind of synesthetic experience. So I wonder if you can talk about what was the motivation behind that?
I don't know where to start, but I had this music piece in my mind as an inspiration, as a let's say a reference of how historically the avant-garde artists involved in primitivism in its most extraordinary expressive way. That if we can imagine the Stravinsky as well as Nijinsky, who did the choreography for Sacre de Printemps, which was premiered in Paris in 1913, they were like most progressive artists from Russia who just arrived in Central Europe, and they were just about to introduce to most sophisticated audience of culture in the world at that time. And I was just wondering and puzzled again that music was actually accompanied with the choreography, which I got to know much later. And then that occasion made me think about like why those artists were involved with this exotic, unknown, primitive motif or subject matter, as you wish. And instead of really studying into the history to get the answer, I was just projecting my own situation overlapped on those historical figures. And then the musical reference became much more significant, at the same time enigmatic. And with the support of the curator who I work with, I decided to dare to use the music as a kind of ritualistic element of the exhibition, that it was played 3 times, like morning, in the middle of the exhibition, and right before, at the end of the exhibition every day. And as you see, maybe later in the next exhibition in Oxford, which was maybe 6 months later, again there was a question from my side how the modernist or Bauhaus artist and the spiritual thinker might have something in common in terms of their interest in movement.
Right.
And maybe I stop here.
Yeah, maybe we should go on to the next folder of images, please. So Haegue just started talking about her next solo exhibition, which was at Modern Art Oxford, that opened in June. And the title of that exhibition was Teacher of Dance. And I guess we can explain what that is. The teacher of dance refers to how would you describe him? A kind of a spiritual teacher, named Gurdjieff, and in certain circles he's well known, in other circles he's not. He's originally from Georgia, I believe, right?
Like
the border between
Armenian part of Russia.
Right, Armenian part of Russia, and he traveled throughout Central Asia all the way to Tibet and China, and then collected sacred music and dance. And this is in the early 20th century. And then migrated to Berlin and then Paris, and later also in New York. And then in these cities sprouted certain communities of followers. Actually, if you don't know anything about Gurdjieff, you can go to YouTube, and there are so many videos about Gurdjieff. So it's kind of like a parallel or alternative almost understanding of certain avant-garde inspiration, because there were many people such as Frank Lloyd Wright, who was one of the followers of Gurdjieff, right? So,
especially his wife.
Wright's wife.
Yeah.
So in this exhibition, so this became another kind of an inspiration or sort of referential point for this exhibition, and so he, who taught this spiritual awakening or enlightenment through this sacred music and dance that he collected and taught, became part of this. So with this title and the background, you see these sculptures, and this is another body of work that you've been doing called non-indépliables, in English, unfoldables, and in this case you use closed drying racks that are wrapped in different places. But the way that you install these, which contrast from those light sculptures that you showed in Bregenz, in the sense that they are much simpler, but then there is much less sense of movement.
Like in terms of the difference of space and architecture between Bregenz and Oxford, or for me that the Bregenz space was like very elite, but at the same time was very focused space, which is personal, I mean based on personal belief, but at the same time it wasn't casual. And while the space in Oxford were like sympathetic and less maybe charismatic. So if I imagine like dance piece, the space in Bregenz or something like that the avant-garde artists might need, but they were very vulnerable avant-garde artists who haven't had their recognition yet, while the space in Oxford had a aura of like a practicing room for dance piece, right, instead of like stage.
So this is an image actually from Modern Art Oxford, right? So it's not the kind of clean and imposing and authoritative modernist space like Kunsthaus Bregenz, which has the concrete floor and the glass ceiling, but rather it has wooden floor. And then here we're showing one of what you call cake sculptures.
Like official name is dress vehicle, and I used to call them cakes before I found the official title.
Right.
And so as you see, like I call them cake because there are stacks of structure, right, as if there is, cakes has layers.
So in contrast with the unfoldables that we showed, which are sheeted or dressed in those tightly stretched fabrics or knitted sweaters, these are, so they are kind of frozen in motion, while these are movable, right, as you can see with the person in it. So, I mean, how did you arrive at this idea? I mean, was it a kind of natural progression for you after having done that sculpture grouping in Bregenz to think about movement, or how did this evolution happen?
Maybe I have to say first that when I had the show in Bregenz, I was not aware by myself about my own interest in movements. I have thought about the choreography of Nijinsky and the power of music to animate those sculptures as figures who does like movement but without moving physically themselves. So it was rather a vibration of sculpture without changing their location. While in this show I became very conscious that movement in many different ways became a artistic interest. So the undeployable, like non-unfoldable, which were already existed before I had this show, was a starting point as movement as a frozenness. So it's a similar to the approach that I had with the 33 light sculpture in Bregenz. There was actually no physical movement, while there was this foldable object that were frozen through the wrapping. So there is a resistance to movement, and there is a notion of tension as an alternative maybe term for movement. And Dress Vehicle was the commissioned piece, and there were many different, I think, aspects why I came into this idea. First of all, I was interested in how can I kind of reinvent the material, which is a Venetian blind. Since I sensed that I was started to mention like Venetian blind artists, and that was of course like uncomfortable, but at the same time the more important feeling was that I felt responsible to like constantly kind of trying to move the notion of the Venetian blind.
Right.
So if you can remember the images before, there were Venetian blind which were hung,
we have them up here,
high up from your eye level, while the Dress Vehicle became a material which is wrapping your body.
Right.
So both works were kind of escaping the eye level, which was the fundamental orientational point for mobilizing Venetian blind as a visual filter.
Right, right. I mean, so what really struck me about this blind installations is that, of course, you've done this in many different places, including the Korean Pavilion in Venice Biennale and also at the New Museum in New York, of just two places. But those earlier installations that used Venetian blinds were very consciously sort of at your level, as you described, at the eye level. So it was about the experience of being hidden and looking through the blinds at the same time. But what you did in Oxford is that the blinds were, with the exception of those, a couple of them that are touching the floor, were way up high. So that experience was completely different one. So it's almost like the blinds went up and they also came down to the level to create this sculpture that you become actually part of it.
And I don't know if everybody sees the same way, but the movement which were created or generated through this both installation were for me like very uncoordinated, awkward movements. Like in the case of Escaping Transparency, which were the installative work, the audience come into the space and their eyes were fixed very high up. So you don't really pay attention to the space in front of you where you are moving towards.
Right.
So there is this disorientation between the visual sense and the bodily operation.
Right.
And in the Dress Vehicle, I mean, it looks a lot of fun to see someone inside, but once you're inside, actually it's a quite uncomfortable to move around because it's quite bulky.
Right.
It's maybe similar feeling when you drive like big truck and you don't know the width and the length of the car, which became like extension of your body.
Right.
So, and I was interested in those like let's say not entirely free movement, and that brought me back to another reference of Oskar Schlemmer's Triadisches Ballet.
Right.
What is it in English?
Triadic ballet.
Triadic ballet. And I don't know, some of you might know the piece that it's rather a costume designed by Oskar Schlemmer, and it creates like very strongly like certain types of figure, But if you are inside a costume, actually you walk like a marionette. You cannot hardly bend your body, so that all the joints are covered and fixed by
Right.
the dress.
So you kind of have to just move like this or hop around.
Exactly. So I was interested in why the visual, I mean, what's the different interpretation of the movement
Yep.
by the choreographer and maybe visual artists, and especially in the era of Bauhaus. And so I started from the Gurriev's very folk culture oriented spiritual search to Oskar Schlemmer's notion of like locking the body into a custom.
Right. So your mind and interests have been really traveling, crisscrossing temporally and spatially. You know, you talk about obviously Paris in 1913 when Stravinsky and Nijinsky's Rite of Spring debuted, and I think had only 8 performances or something, right? Because it, as everybody knows, caused a huge scandal and almost a riot. And from there, you're going to Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s via this Armenian-Russian spiritual teacher who went the other direction to almost the other edge of the Asian continent. So maybe that's actually a very nice way to talk about the next exhibition that you did. If you could go on to the folder 3. And so this was back in July at Aspen Art Museum, and the mood of the title changed completely too. You called it The Art and Technique of Folding the Land. So those of you who know a bit about Haegue's work, the idea of folding and unfolding, and we just talked a little bit about unfoldables, is an important idea as a kind of a sculptural method in a sense, right? But this perhaps is the first time that it became almost kind of overarching concept for a whole exhibition. And so could you talk a little bit about how you came to be interested in that idea, which is a Taoist idea, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about kind of mental jump in terms of the definition of movement. So let's say in Oxford, it was primarily the attempt to understand like bodily movement, like human movement with their body. And I think the art of folding the land describe like how one want to like take a journey in a geographic sense. It's not like walking or making, shape and form with the body. It's like I want to locate somewhere else, to encounter something else. And the term art and technique of folding the land coming from the Taoists, that there were many fantastic kind of imaginary technique described by Taoism, which I was totally drawn into because of their impossibility and the imagination of things that we might right now trying to achieve through the technology, and that's one of them is like moving oneself from one place to another.
Right.
So they describe like instead of like moving fast from moving fast in order to go from one place to another, they were saying you fold the landscape and then make a normal step and then unfold the landscape and you are already somewhere that was very far away before. And they kind of folding the landscape, folding the land was it addressed like dimension of maybe imagination, how like subject like can relate to the environment and landscape and
well,
and
I mean, you were in Aspen and looking at all those peaks in the Rockies, and and then the river stream where you found the driftwoods that you found as well, right? But I guess perhaps we should also talk about two things. One is that strangely shaped temporary walls, almost like the blades. I think at one point you described them as like the blades of the chocolate grinder, a la Duchamp. But also, so this is something that you've done, but perhaps even more complicated at here. So they're not just temporary walls for hanging works, but they do something else. And the second thing that you've done for the first time in this exhibition is to create that the wallpaper using some of your older work. So if you see the back of the image where you see these strangely bizarre shaped rocks and one of Haegue's own work there, that's a single piece of wallpaper which was designed in collaboration with a designer and then printed and installed. So I think these two things are also closely related to this idea of hopping or kind of transporting or teleporting between times and spaces, right?
I think in a physical sense, what's happening in the space is you have a space which is so much layered and fragmented through the wall, but also at the same time through the wallpaper, which has a distorted perspective of distorted depth of the space. So the wallpaper is flat, but it contains an object which has wrong scales and just stacked simply one onto another.
Yep.
And you see those scenery through the fragmented ornamental shaped wall. And at the same time, you tend to move around in the exhibition space. So there is a constantly different cut out view unfolding and coming to you. So that was the layering was actually the strategy I was employing in order to achieve the effect of art and technique of folding the land somewhat. And there is the feeling of like simultaneity,
Simultaneity, yeah.
That, and at the same time the delayness because of the strongly, I believe, because of wallpaper, because it's nothing but an illusion. They have no physical presence in the space. It's just flat wall, and those contradictory perceptual effects were colliding with each other, and.
Right. So we move through spaces and exhibitions super fast, so we don't want to go over too much over our time, so maybe we'll just take a couple of questions if people have them.
Sorry.
Any question? Comment?
Maybe it is a bit awkward to talk about only movement while you are looking into like 3 different exhibitions.
Right.
But we decided specifically talking about the recent production, which were less mediated and very current in my mind. There is.
My name is Billy. I was just wondering, maybe it's a boring question, but about your process in terms of working on 3 pretty separate pieces or exhibitions with all 3 varied backgrounds. Like, are you constantly having 6 things on the burner, or do you really subject yourself fully to one topic and then just move on to something else afterwards, or how do you do that?
On the burner?
Like cooking, you know, you have a couple pots warming.
I like that expression. I don't know. I mean, Doryun also asked me today, because I was mentioning a couple of other artists who I'm currently interested in, his question was whether I discovered them recently. And the answer was actually no. Like, I knew some of them when I was student, and some of them very recently, but all of a sudden they seems to be very connected in my mind. So I think it is less important to say like how much of ideas and researches were like ready in my mind. I think most of things probably for the other artists as well exist in the mind as a potentiality, and when they unfold themselves into something that I cannot really explain. But what I can only say about those three exhibitions is that things has been quite evolutionary since 2008. Like, there are a couple of exhibitions build kind of work cycles or like kind of family, like siblings and twins, and two exhibitions are like twins, and the next one come into that group and became a kind of siblings, and these three, I think I haven't conceived like that, but it became as a result kind of, I think, medium intensive study about the movement, but movement not only like physical movement, but also including like maybe non-movement, also maybe spiritual or mental movement, etc.
Great.
Oh, also handicap movement. It's very important to me.
Well, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much, Haegue, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.